Welcome to the ClassicalU podcast. I'm Jesse Hake. I'm the director at ClassicalU. ClassicalU is a subsidiary of Classical Academic Press, a curriculum and monograph publishing company. At ClassicalU, we provide training for teachers and parents interested in learning more about classical education, how to deliver this method in your classrooms, in your homes. I mostly spend time talking with presenters and live learning event guests, and we look forward to sharing more with you as you tune in. Thank you. Joelle, it's good to have you on our podcast as we're getting ready to roll out a course, Women in the Tradition. It's very exciting. It's been a long time in the making with a lot of different contributors, and I'm extremely excited to finally be able to share this with everyone. And you and I have known each other for a long time and are friends and colleagues, in addition to laboring in the renewal together and working on ClassicalU content. But you've been with CAP and as an author and a co-owner in the past, and our vice president now, sales, marketing, and operations. Mm-hmm. And you've written two of our books, The Art of Argument, The Discovery of Deduction, bringing students in through informal logic and then formal logic. And we taught together years and years ago. We're both hired by Chris initially as teachers. Mm-hmm. So a lot of our conversation, I know, will be about kind of being students and looking to the great masters and the canon and the nature of that. So it's great to talk to you in that role as teachers who we'll see what you have to say about it. But I think of teachers as really kind of model students in some ways. And I think you'd probably agree with that to some degree. But this is fun. I love layering, actually. I get to interview people from out of town, but I love when all the layers come together. And we're talking as colleagues, friends, and on the topic of this exciting course. So thank you for being here. And I'll open up. I got to hear a talk you gave this summer at SEL on this topic, and you've been speaking about it. I know you did a master's degree, and your final paper or thesis was on this topic as well. Mm-hmm. A master's with Eastern University's MAT program. The topic at SEL, you kind of expanded and added some new things, and I got to catch up as well in the pre-conference lecture that you gave there at SEL. And two phrases there jumped out at me as I was reading that. You said students should not aspire toward contributing to the canon, but instead should aspire toward furthering the reach of the canon. That we should really be thinking of our own work in this way and even holding that up to our students. How does that relate to this question of the canon and how we think about the canon and how it inspires us and our students?
Wow, that's a big question right off the bat. Well, first of all, thank you for having me. It's a real pleasure to be here and to be talking with you. I'm very excited about this project, the Women in the Tradition course on ClassicalU. It has been a long time in coming, and but there have been so many wonderful contributors from all across the country who have written lectures, and I've certainly learned a lot through it, and certainly at that the MAT courses that I had taken through Eastern's program, that was a real eye-opener. It really did start to change the way that I was asking that question that you asked, and that is that we spend a lot of time, and at least I've been hearing a lot more recently. Is the canon closed? Mm-hmm. Is it static? Is it dynamic? Who should be included? When and under what circumstances? And I think a lot of people are making some very good comments and reflections and cases for what they think. And in many cases, I think too, people are just kind of trying to sort it out a little bit, and they're offering up an idea. From most of the folks that I've talked to, there isn't an idea that's sort of fully formed. So I too want to note that my idea isn't fully formed, and I'm sort of entering the conversation a little bit with this idea and the perspective that I'm taking on it. It isn't that I think that I've sort of I've arrived, and this is the answer that everyone's been waiting for. I think this idea, we think perhaps too much about who belongs in it, rather than recognizing that regardless of what it is, and exactly who gets to be in it and which works get to be in it, we're all interacting with it to some degree, and contributors who would be excluded from the sort of capital C canon of it, they really are the ones that have given us the ability to interact with it at all, because it is in furthering the reach of the canon that we and our students have the ability to engage with it in any way at all. Short of that, it wouldn't have made its way to us at all. It had to be with people lesser known, less, and I don't mean this in any kind of sort of personal value, but less significant contributions, less valuable, prestigious work. It had to be those folks that kept it top of mind, and discussing it in small groups, in small schools, around tables, and in dark rooms with a cigar and whatever. It had to be those things that kept it going. And then in the classrooms of teachers that are of no remarkable name. And in my pre-conference talk, I listed off, my relatively insignificant contributions, but to the work that I've sort of committed my adult life to, and I'm never going to be, discussed in the same breath as Aristotle, except I am coupling my name with him, but it's just not even the same thing. And yet the work I'm doing is trying to extend its reach so that future generations have access to it. And when it comes to women in the tradition, I think we're framing the question a little bit, maybe too aggressively when we ask the question, which women belong in it. I don't think that's the right question. It's the wrong pretext. I'm wondering, which women have, or are there women and men alike who have furthered the reach, and are they worth studying as master students, so that our students and we ourselves as master students can see, well, what did other master students do with their experience with the canon? How can we learn from them? Because I'm never going to be a Boethius, and I don't have there's no hope for me to be a Dante, but I might see some other master students who I could see how they interacted with those masters, and be inspired to continue to do the work that furthers the reach for another generation.
Thank you. This, you're doing several different things. I think with this, you're taking the pressure off the kind of bigger question, which you're acknowledging is legitimate, and you're glad to hear people talking about it. But kind of what is the canon, and saying let's step back from that, because really the women in the tradition question is first about a sort of lower pressure question of how we all engage with the canon. Right. And it's also whatever, the phrase living tradition gets, I think importantly discussed as a part of that conversation of what the canon is, what the tradition is. But whatever makes it living has got to be all of us, right, who aren't in the canon, right, but we love it, we teach it, we sit under it. Yeah, you're doing a number of really helpful things with that move, but you're obviously advocating that we should bring into the classroom some other master students or great teachers who aren't in the canon, but whose texts help us engage with the canon.
Right.
How does that? What are some examples of that in your own teaching where you felt like that's been helpful to you?
Sure.
Who are some of those people in that category that you've brought in, either, I guess, as a student yourself that you've seen others bring in, or you're in your own teaching with your students, where that's been a help?
I think it's even one of our, sort of pedagogical practices that we often, that we require. I think maybe requires the wrong word, but we certainly lean on in our classrooms. And that is that we invite students to come and present and to not just present information, but maybe even teach a lesson, maybe retell the story, maybe provide examples. We invite math students up to the board to work the problems. We invite students to take the lead on Socratic discussions at times. There are all these different opportunities, and that's because I think we've learned a couple of things. Number one, students learn really well by being in a position of leadership, and by thinking to themselves, how can I break this down so that somebody else can learn from it? Students also learn really well from their peers in some cases when their peers have had to wrestle through some of the sort of intellectual barriers that they themselves wrestle with, that teachers sometimes forget about or have forgotten that they had to wrestle with. But it also, I think, does something that's even more significant, and that reminds us that the teacher really isn't the center of the classroom. It's really the text. It's really the curriculum. It's really the idea or the question that really sits in the center of whatever a good class is. And the teacher isn't the star. It's the content that's the star. And so when we allow another person to operate as the MC, the host, the teacher for some of that time, it does it again reinforces that we're here to discuss this, not to watch Mr. So-and-so and his really dynamic classroom presentation. Of course, there's a time for that. I'm not trying to be extremist about we should never do this and we should always do that. So just thinking of it that way, should we read from the masters? Sure. Should we? Will our students be able to plumb the depths all by themselves? No. They certainly, and if they can, then we've got a sort of a savant of some kind, and that might be really extraordinary. But what they might really benefit from is watching someone else and reading how someone else interacted with that master, because it then demonstrates for the student what questions did they ask, how did they respond, what was important to them, where did they go with it after they kind of interacted with it, where did it take them? Those are things that a teacher could potentially do in the classroom, but how much, why should we limit ourselves to just that one individual in the classroom when we have, when I think about the host of folks who have been interacting with Dante over the centuries, and the fact that other people have been writing about him and his work and interacting with it, there's something really incredible and sort of majestic about the idea that students would be able to see how it has resonated with others, and that might actually make it more real to them in some ways. For myself personally, I have been probably more often. I have been a student in every situation, and whether in every capacity that I've been in professionally. I've always been able to have a mentor, to have someone to whom I could look and watch and learn from. And that has been exceedingly helpful to be able to, connect with that individual and find out whether it was me as a student an actual student in a classroom, or even me as a teacher. I even had sort of sought out, mentors as an educator, but then even now in my professional, kind of other professional life, I have mentors in that capacity as well. It is sort of it's a skill and a practice to find those people in your life, regardless of what vocation you find yourself in. Is anybody going to be able to be, and I'll throw out some names which probably will be divisive in some ways, but a Steve Jobs or a Bill Gates or a, whoever, pick your favorite, most successful, if you will, person in any category of professional world. Are we going to be able to be that person? Well, probably not, but that's why there are so many business development books out there. That's why there are so many strategic growth and management books and seminars you can go to. And it's because these are people who are furthering the reach of those conversations as well, so that we can learn in our small little company of less than 30 people, how to run a business. We don't get to go to Apple and sit in on their meetings, but we can learn from others, as the reach of maybe some of their successes makes its way to us. So I think it's a practice. It's a practice of humility, which is really the undercurrent of the idea that I'm kind of tossing out there. I really do want us to think about this coming from a very humble perspective of what can I learn and from whom can I learn? And it might be that we learn some really great lessons from other students, not just masters.
So it's both a move of humility, but it's also ennobling because it's realizing that we all have the capacity to participate in the tradition of Aristotle, who you referenced as an inspiration, and in your own work writing about logic, teaching logic.
Sure.
In a recent review in the Principia Journal of Classical Education, you wrote about a work that is one of the figures in our course, The Women in the Tradition, the vision of Christine de Pizan. Am I pronouncing that right?
I think so.
This, in your review, it sounds like an example of imitation, not just criticism. So she's responding, I think, in the highest way that you can respond, which is to imitate the masters as a way of responding to the masters. But you put her forward as an example of a figure that you wouldn't really get into the question of is she in the canon, not in the canon. Let's just acknowledge the easy point that she's clearly a great student of the masters. Where do you see her? What are some works that are required in the curriculum where her vision would be a great companion piece to read and study alongside?
So Christine, the vision of Christine de Pizan, which is the book that I reviewed for Principia Journal, it is, and I note this right at the very top of that article. It is a dense work. She makes. I had to read it several times. And then there was a very helpful essay at the end of the book by Sheila McLeod, who I relied on to help me kind of make some very important connections. She's a scholar, and it was really excellent essay at the end of that book. So I think that book might be a little bit further out of reach than a book that maybe a middle school student would be able to sort of digest. However, if you do have a student who is at the level where they have read Augustine, they have read some Boethius, and they've read some Dante, this would be, just because those are the three masters that she, on philosophy, the Divine Comedy, and then a variety of Augustine's pieces. But if you did have a student who had some exposure to some of those works, to watch this other student, Christine, do what Mortimer Adler talks about, which is syntopical reading, right? It's that fourth level. It's the sort of the most sophisticated kind of reading that you can do, where you're actually synthesizing on a variety of levels from a variety of resources on a variety of topics, and you're kind of bringing it all together. And if you're looking for a way to sort of model what does Adler really mean by syntopical reading, this is an excellent piece to sort of to demonstrate that. Again, you would have to know a little bit of something about each one of those, and to be able to do that well. And a teacher as a guide could obviously do that. But that is essentially what we would want students, maybe at the college level, to be able to do when students are taking their English literature classes or whatever it might be. Students aren't going to be giving a book report about a single book that they read. They're going to be reading a book, and then they're going to be asked to interact with it without just conjecture of opinion. How does this relate to, interact with, and we see this from other folks as well, whether it's Martin Luther King Jr. And his letter from a Birmingham jail, where he's doing something very similar with very different resources in mind. But when we're trying to teach students how to take knowledge, build on that knowledge, and say something in a fresh way, or a way that is impactful to them, in a way that is kind of new knowledge, in some ways discoveries that they made. That's really what we're hoping that they do at some point. Now, fourth grader, like I said, isn't going to be able to do that, but a freshman in college should be able to do that kind of writing, or at least know that that's the goal.
Yeah.
Along with those masters, this would be a great companion, I think. So to be able to frame Christine's work in its in an appropriate context. But yeah.
So she's possibly a little out of reach in your judgment for maybe certainly middle school, but even high school. But a great model for this kind of synthesis and application that brings together multiple pieces, works from the canon, and actually applies them. Martin Luther King's letter is application synthesis from a lot of great sources, and probably a better example for potentially even middle or high school students.
Sure.
So let me push you on the harder question, though, that your kind of reframing does, I think very helpfully say we don't have to beat ourselves up over the hard question, but where are there women in the canon? What would be a strong candidate or two, that you would advocate for?
You're going to get me in trouble. It really is such a divisive, and I don't know that it should be, but to make the claim that someone belongs in the canon, I think we first have to agree on sort of what are the requirements for that inclusion.
You sound like a logic teacher, which is very legitimate.
I think that if we're going to have that question asked, really, we do have to back up and ask ourselves, what are some of what's the rubric that we would use to sort of to evaluate anyone. It certainly can't be that they would have always been known, because then Beowulf is out. It certainly can't be that it has to be from before the 20th century, because then Lewis is out. There have to be some other kinds of questions that we would sort of ask. And I think actually that Brian Williams does a very good job in the first issue of Principia, and his opening essay there, where he talks about what he addresses some of those questions, very, very systematically.
Yeah.
But are the ideas enduring? Are they interacting with the enduring ideas? Are they making contributions that are lasting themselves? Are they furthering the reach of the canon? So there, and I'm summarizing far too generally to give that essay justice, but there's a host of questions, and I don't know that we all agree on what those questions are, and I don't know that we all agree on what those answers are, and we might be jumping too far ahead to even talk about what is the canon, or is it static or is it dynamic? I think that's I think some of these other questions influence even that question. Yeah. Because if you can start with these other questions about, well, what makes for a canon-worthy text, then you'll know whether or not it's been static or dynamic based off of how you answered some of those questions. Yeah. So that's, I think, the conversation that probably needs to happen before we get into the who's who. We might just want to let the evidence. So this does go back to sort of logic and rhetoric. Yeah. The first canon of rhetoric is what we call invention or discovery, and it's named that way because it's supposed to deter the student from thinking, I'm coming in with my thesis already prepared. It's supposed to come in with questions and allow the thesis to fall out of the discovery process or the invention process. So to jump ahead to some of these other questions sort of already assumes a thesis in place. I think the canon is static. Well, okay, now that's a thesis. Then, of course, if that's what you believe, you're going to go find the evidence for making that belief stick or proving it to be true in some way. But if we back up from that and we ask other questions, then we can allow the evidence to sort of decide or demonstrate for us, well, based off of what we see, is it static or is it dynamic? Oh, well, I guess it looks like it might be a little bit more this way than that way. And that then answers the question based off of the evidence, if you will, and the study and the discussion without jumping too far to the thesis. So I didn't answer your question.
No, but you, like a great teacher, set up the more important parameters that are part of the ongoing conversation. I mean, this is something that it's great to see classical educators, engaging seriously with and disagreeing about, which is also part of the tradition.
That's right. It's friendship building.
Yeah. So, we may women in the tradition is the kind of working title of our course, but this more basic way of framing it's almost like women in the tradition and engaged with the tradition. That you're kind of making it a bigger picture.
Could I just note there too that the title that we chose for Women in the Tradition, that was the title of my thesis. It wasn't the women's tradition.
Right.
It was the women in the tradition, and to what degree, and in exactly what the quality and the quantity, and all of that is sort of. It's not being noted there. It's really just talking about the fact that we have to acknowledge there have been women, in it and contributing to it, and I think that's an important that preposition is an important one, and we need it's a small word, but it does convey a lot about what it is that we're trying to do with the course, and it's really to just identify that there are some women within it, and let's look and see who they are.
Yeah, and certainly, I think you and I would agree, at any rate, that that it's important to recognize that it's not a completely obvious answer as to who all they might be.
Right.
There are some, and it's a good conversation who they might be and who would be adjacent. And
sure.
Yeah. That little preposition "in" also opens the door to the category when you're reading great literature and the great works in the canon. There's a lot of references to women that aren't historical figures, human beings. You reference in your review in Principia of the Vision of Christine de Pizan. Augustine was instructed by Bishop Ambrose. Boethius walked with Lady Philosophy. Dante was guided by the first poet Virgil, and then by the Lady Beatrice. So you have sort of teachers and they're great teachers. Out of the four examples that you give of great teachers, two of them, Lady Philosophy and Beatrice, are sort of mythic figures.
Right.
Obviously, once you start thinking about this, it's a big list. All the virtues are ladies. All of the muses are women. The 7 liberal arts are all depicted as great ladies, and you could go on and on. The inspiration of figures like Beatrice, who are kind of sometimes might have some historical connection, in the poet's life, but generally are really part of their kind of imaginary inspirational world. Why is it that? Do you have any thesis, any theories? Why it is that? Well, another favorite of mine before I even try to formulate the question is Lady Nature. C.S. Lewis has some really extreme language about how we've killed Lady Nature, who's our greatest teacher, generations back, kind of with Lewis is referencing, the Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution, kind of this, our separation from the natural world more and more as we're kind of inside of automobiles and all of that stuff coming together. But certainly you could say a lot of kind of virtual people are very, very hard on
For sure.
virtual things in the classical world. Some of it, I think, gets a little hyperbolic and out of proportion, but we have a lot of agreement about some of those concerns. But this idea that we've killed some of our greatest teachers in these mythic figures, these great ladies, the virtues, the muses, I'm really kind of talking around two different questions, I think. But the first one I was starting to articulate is just why so many great mythic women conceived of as our sort of most exalted teachers.
That's a really great question, sort of a profound question, and I'm not sure that I am the right person to give a final answer to it. But
I don't think anyone. Yeah, I'm supposed to contribute in the course on this topic, and I don't think anyone should think they have the answer to a question like this. But
well, you've taken the pressure off a little bit then. So, I guess I would say my opinion on this is that I think some of the wisest among us throughout history have recognized that there is a symmetry to the ordered creation that has been made, that the male and female attributes, such as they've been considered historically throughout the ages, have been complements and harmonious with one another, such that it wouldn't be. I don't even know that that the world could have been thought of, exclusively in masculine terms anymore. That it can be thought of exclusively in feminine terms, and I've been. It's been a delight, as I should say. It's been a delight in my studies to see so many wise and pious men, many of them Christian men throughout the ages, who have aspired to the seat of knowledge, have aspired to wisdom, who have been seeking truth, and have recognized that there are these sort of feminine attributes, and that they have ascribed feminine mythic goddesses, if you will, or created beings to these ideas, and I do think that it's because they complement the virtuous man. And I've heard Chris often say, because as I have told you very recently, I don't speak Latin, so any derivatives that I've come by have come by in bits and snatches from working with Chris over the years. But the idea of virtue is the root there. The vir is really Latin for man, and it would be that a real man would have had these different pieces. These different attributes, characteristics, and qualities. And so I think it's really this aspiration that man is sort of incomplete without the partner that was offered to him, that was made for him, at the point of creation. And these virtues are the parts that sort of enable him to be a more harmonious, more fully created human being. So that's sort of my sense of why, and I think it has been in the study of that. So the women have always been present, regardless of whether or not their name is attached to the byline, and that's been sort of remarkable as I've gone through my studies and very humbly looked at this in asking the question of, where are the women? They're there all along.
Yeah.
They're writing with the men. They're inspiring the men. They are in conversation with those men, contemplating right alongside of them. And then it may have been a man who put pen to paper and that got carried through the centuries, but the very best of those writings was done with a host of conversations and dialogue with these great ladies.
Yeah, it is. It really is fascinating. Like all of the muses, just how prominent it is when you start to think about it. And I mean, certainly at some level, the role, the reality of motherhood. Every one of us, men and women, right? All of us, our first sort of most fundamental teacher is a mother. And that's just kind of elemental reality in all of our lives.
Sure.
Circling back on, you made the point that this isn't the course where it's kind of inspired our conversation here isn't titled Women's Tradition, but there's a legitimacy in my opinion, since we're using opinion, I think helpfully and appropriately to point out that we're not making, speaking with some kind of ridiculous authority, but there's a legitimacy to seeking to find, our own connections and relationships to the canon and to the tradition from the various places and backgrounds, that we come from. And as men, boys in our classrooms, as Black, white, Hispanic, there's all these different contact points, and the tradition is absolutely expansive enough and a full and life-giving story that has all these contact points in it. I think Angel Parham uses the crossroads, language a lot, and there's many wonderful ways to do this. You've referenced a little bit. Where are the women? It's a legitimate question, and how do you speak to? I think it's legitimate, but it's even kind of regardless of the legitimacy. It's a point of for some of our students in the modern day. It's just a reality that I think we lose students over some of these kinds of things.
Sure.
We lose their hearts, and it's it's all about our hearts at the end of the day. So how do you, as a teacher, how do you encourage other teachers to? And it's not just about your girls or your boys in your classroom.
Sure.
I think actually you can sort of distort or lose the hearts of both girls and boys over a question of or how you talk about how you engage with the women in the tradition, whether it's the the great mythic teachers, virtues we're talking about, or actual authors, and whether the authors we're reading are in the canon or engaged with the canon. What are some points of advice, encouragement to teachers that you would give, and kind of how to get this right? Because it's not easy.
No. Well, I think when we politicize almost anything, it makes it a lot more challenging to get it right. But I do think there is a little bit of a simplicity here if it's an orientation of the heart. So the first comment I would make is that part of our spiritual act of worship, if we're Christian believers, is something that Christ asked us to do right from the get-go, and that is this do in remembrance of me, right? At the Last Supper, this idea of remembering is an act of worship, and remembering who we are, what our heritage is. This is something that we are commanded to do, and as a spiritual sacrament. But it's also, I don't think any spiritual sacrament is really intended to be sort of a one-dimensional concept. I think these are embodied practices. When we fail to remember, and when we allow ourselves to have sort of the amnesia that can wash over us by not being intentional about remembering, that I think is an impairment that we all face, that we are kind of all independently and individually responsible for. And as teachers, then I think it's our job to educate ourselves to know, certainly in the 32 weeks that you have, with the number of classes that you have, you're going to have to make some tough choices. But are there folks that would be valuable to include, and not just because they're the headliners, but because it's important to, and this is not a unique idea, remember, like put members back into the body of whatever it is that we're seeking to discuss or learn from, that kind of thing. As I think about Robert Louis Wilkins' book, Remembering the Christian Past, and that he had some really fantastic insights there about the importance of remembering and why it's essential to do so within our academic arenas. it actually doing so allows for, I think, it gives us some tools to combat perhaps some of the woke ideologies that I think are kind of infecting and sort of crushing in on some of our classrooms, regardless of whether they're Christian or classical or that kind of thing. Without the foundation there as the knowledge of who we've been and where we've come from and who those people were that have made contributions and furthered the reach. When we lift all of that out there it provides a sort of a very thin plane that can be crushed and cracked very easily by modern ideologies and modern ideas. We really need the dense support of the members from the past. I think that's an essential component to combating what it is that we're facing on the front lines in our classrooms. A final thing that I would just sort of note, though, as well, is that and this is an analogy or a metaphor that I use throughout the paper that I wrote and the talks that I've given, and that is this idea of a rich tapestry, and it's a textile, and it's not, I don't think, accidental. I don't think any of us think it's accidental to note that when we think of textbooks and texts that we read from, that there's a weaving that goes on within them, and that we have when we omit threads, with these sort of thick black lines of, maybe prematurely defining the canon or prematurely deciding who gets to be in and who gets to be out. We've really robbed ourselves of the rich tapestry that we could be passing down to future generations. So there's a variety of reasons for why I think it's easy. It's an easier sell, if you will. It's an easier conversation to have. And I'm not talking about, you'll notice I haven't brought up anything that's really about preference or, equality or making sure that we're diverse enough or, any of those words that can so often require so much definition and packaging. I don't think that those are, altogether bad words. They can be used in different ways. We have to define them well. And I think in many cases we do. But it's really not about quotas and, that's the wrong framework for how to think about this. It's really about what is our spiritual act of worship? What are we losing academically when we gut our academic past? And what are we missing out on the rich tapestry that we could be passing on to our students? Those are the kind of the big questions we should be asking when we think about now who should we include in our curriculum.
So there's a wholeness to the past, and where we very easily forget just how full and complete it is, and it is suited and life-giving to our own classrooms now. I like that language of remembering and reconstituting the body that we so easily lose, both in those around us right now and the relationship of all of us in the present to all of those in the past.
Sure.
It's rich, yeah. What are some what would be your kind of elevator pitch for why someone should listen to this course, Women in the Tradition?
Let's see. Well, I guess it's not terribly original, but I'll borrow from Augustine because why not?
Can't go wrong.
Can't go wrong by borrowing from Augustine. But he talks about the importance of memory. And he phrases it in Confessions. I think it's in book 10, maybe it's in book 8, I can't recall, where he talks about these ideas being so far back and thrust beyond that it requires some other person or to help bring those things forth, and so that we can remember them. And that really is sort of a spiritual act of worship when it comes to sacramental ideas and that sort of thing, but it's also a very academic idea. And it's an obligation, I think, that we have for, and part of why I think we signed on as teachers is to help our students recognize what has been sort of thrust back and forgotten. I mean, that is what the renewal of classical education is all about.
Yeah.
And this is just a small piece of that.
It's a never-ending task, and this is just a part of the big ongoing task.
That's right.
Beautiful. Thank you, Jolie. It's been wonderful
Thank you for having
to
me.
get to chat. Thank you so much for listening to the Classical U podcast. Please do check out our website, classicalu.com, and our teacher magazine, Altum. We hope you've enjoyed these conversations with presenters and live learning event hosts with Classical U.